Good afternoon. My name is Jody Brockington, and I'd like to welcome you all to the National Urban League's Digital Career Success Series. Today's topic is breaking career rules. There are so many rules that we're told our whole lives from birth and I think all the way to that last day, how we're supposed to even breathe properly. And today we have two phenomenal speakers for you, both Dr. Danielle Moss-Lee and Emil Bryant. But this topic is really important because we keep finding that people have these rules that they're living by, and then they're not going after the careers and the goals and the dreams that you really want to do, that you're taking a job and staying there too long, or your father says, or your mother says, or your auntie says, or your professor at school said you should do this, that, and the other. So today we're here with Emil Bryant, who is a great FOJ, a friend of Jody. He's the author of Start with a Sparkle, which is a phenomenal book if you have not read it already. And he is the innovator of brazen creativity. And that I'll have him explain himself because I'm still trying to learn. But you see below that there is a brief little description of it. But Emil definitely knows a lot about rules and clearly knows how to break them since he's had a long military career. So hopefully some of his anecdotes and stories today will allow him to share some of those, but he knows how to take orders, give orders, and also break some orders. So Emil, thank you so much for joining us today. We also have Dr. Danielle Moss-Lee, and she is truly a true FOJ from way back. We have even been neighbors on the Upper West Side in New York City, and she is one of my true rule breakers. She's had every job I think that I haven't had, and I've had all the others. And currently she serves as the chief of staff at the New York Civil Liberties Union and is just onboarding. So she's in the midst of trying to figure out rules while trying to break one by, her former role was the CEO of the YWCA of New York. So people would look at her cross-eyed and say, why would you not want to be the CEO and you become a chief of staff at a whole nother organization? So hopefully she will share that today. She also is the co-founder of Ebony Vanguard. So I hope you guys start following her and those posts that you might see on LinkedIn. And she is the president of the Black Agency Executives, which started a long time ago with my best friend Jody Patterson's father. And they take all the top black executives at all the nonprofit organizations throughout New York City and bring them together. So it doesn't matter if you're working for the Jewish Community Center and you are the head of programs there and you're African American or Black. You're a member. You could be the top Black person at a urban league and be a part. So she brings all those folks together to solve problems for African Americans in New York City. So she's powerful. And then you see, not only does her YWCA work fall into the New York City's Council of Young Women's Initiative for the New York City Commissioner of Gender Equity. So women's rights, feminist. So she has a lot of views, a lot to share, and I hope you guys really enjoy her this afternoon. So thank you, Danielle, also for joining us and being a part of Breaking Career Rules. I'd like Emil to kick us off and tell us a little bit about what they're going to hear today.
Hey, thank you, Jody, and welcome everybody. You know, one of the things that rule breakers do is assess what a rule is and if they should and how to break it. And so we are rule breakers. It's not just it's not just me and Danielle. Every one of you who's online today is also a rule breaker. You may not realize it, you may not claim it, but at some point you're going to be faced with a rule that doesn't make sense to you. And one of the things that entrepreneurs know about not making sense is that when they see an opportunity, they break the rule, they disrupt the industry, they change how business is done. And so we are rule breakers and entrepreneurs, and that's what leaders do. Leaders know how to follow the rules to get things done. They also know when and how to wisely break the rules. We're always going to be rock solid performers. None of us who's broken a rule, Jody, Danielle, or myself, did so from a position of weakness. We did so from a position of strength. Being a rock solid performer is that strength. And we're always students of the game. We always look for opportunities to learn and grow so that we understand the environment within which we operate, so we know how to break rules, when to break rules, and with whom to break rules. We're teachers because we're going to spend time today and throughout our careers helping other people learn how to look at their environment, look at their situation, and make the best judgment, make the best decision, make the best out of the opportunities presented. And we're thinkers. Clearly, we've spent time. Danielle is a EDD. She is very well seasoned in formal education. And as you look at her bio on LinkedIn and other places, you'll find that she's someone who's actually taken time to sit down and contemplate problems and solutions. Myself, as a military member for many, many years, I too found that one of my superpowers was to sit down and think through situations before I acted. And let me tell you, for those of you who are listening, if you do not realize that thinking is breaking a rule in today's age where everyone wants to be action-oriented, stopping and taking a moment to sit and think changes the whole game and is oftentimes rule breaking in and of itself. You know, as we look forward to the next things that we're going to do, we're going to talk about 4 things today. And Danielle and I, as we were kind of working through this, we wanted to just give you some really basic tips and tools, and then we're going to take your questions. So please make sure that throughout the conversation today, as you listen to me, Danielle, that you offer your questions through, type them up in the chat box and send them over to us, because we want to answer questions for about half the time we're on there together. The lesson today is just going to be, what are the rules? What's the problem with those rules? Why do we break them, and how do we break them wisely? And so that overview kind of just sets the stage for how to become a career rule breaker. So what are the rules? One of the things that you'll find out is that the rules come from 2 places. They come from outside of you and inside of you. The external rules are usually unwritten. They're socioeconomic norms. They're explicit and implicit organizational culture. Almost always those rules are well known. Sometimes you'll get a pamphlet or a booklet when you first start a job that says, here's our basic rules, or you might see something on a wall. Those external rules govern the place where you work or where you operate. But the internal rules, which are also unwritten, very few of us have a list of rules we follow. They're ingrained in us from literally from birth. It's the accumulated wisdom of our experience, the shared wisdom from our parents and mentors and coaches and friends, our peers. And so between these external and internal, almost always unwritten rules, we're bounded in our behavior. And the boundaries of our behavior are the boundaries of our success oftentimes, because we don't know we're following rules. A lot of times the rules are implicit, they're hidden, they're quiet, they're assumed. And so our behavior is governed accordingly. We're acting without thinking. We're acting without consciously being aware of the effect of our actions, or consciously aware that we're following a rule that may or may not be to our credit or to our detriment. So as we look at what the rules are, just understand that those 2 sources are where the rules come from. But in both cases, the reason why they're the first sub-bullet in each of those main points is that they're unwritten. And we want to take those unwritten rules and bring them to light. So one of the things that you'll find is that the problem with rules is that when the internal and external match, there are a few problems. But when they don't match, it's almost a never-ending source of conflict. And many of you in your workplaces, and if you have any questions or you have comments or stories, by all means, please write them in the chat box and send them forward so we can talk about them. But one of the things is when they don't match, when the internal and external rules, what governs me personally doesn't match with what governs me in the environment within which I operate, I find myself in conflict. Sometimes because, remember, almost all of the time these rules are unwritten, we can't figure out why there's conflict. We may be breaking a rule or stepping on an organization's culture and not realizing it because the rules are unwritten. The unwritten rules that I operate under internally and the unwritten rules that I'm expected to operate under externally from the outside source, they're in conflict. And therefore, there's this conflict that we can't resolve easily because we're not looking at the rules. So one of the ways to break rules best is just to simply acknowledge that there's potentially a conflict in how I govern myself and how I'm expected to govern myself based on the internal and external rules. And so one of the things that we want to do today is help you understand how rules often hinder our performance and creativity, because the limits can become coffins to our ingenuity and performance. And what that means is simply when you don't know you're being limited, you don't know which rules to break or how to break them, then you don't know how best to perform. And given the circumstance, you may find yourself challenged. And you don't necessarily want that challenge, because your creativity, your ingenuity, your performance may hinge upon not whether you can actually do a job or do well at a specific project or task, but if you can follow or know how to break a specific rule.
Can I add something here? This is Danielle.
Hi, Danielle, please do.
So I also want us, obviously this is the National Urban League, to be thinking about the ways in which institutional and structural racism and implicit bias also impact the rules and how they are applied to people of color in particular.
That's a great point, and that's something that a lot of times people of color struggle with, because we are not familiar with the socioeconomic norms of a specific workplace. We're not familiar with the biases that come from an institution created by or managed by people who do not look like or act like us or come from our background. There are also people who have explicit bias. In other words, there are people who don't like you for your color, but they can't express that in the workplace. So it comes out in these very subtle ways. Sometimes it's a rule, sometimes it's a norm, sometimes it's just a way of addressing your speaking. And all of these are factors in how we see ourselves in the workplace and how we function in the workplace.
Yeah, and I thought that was important because I get so many calls, most recently from a young woman that I've been a mentor to, and I think mentoring has to also be centered in this discussion, who is a broadcast journalist in a mid-market. She is the only person of color on doing the news on all three networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC. And she is being paid less than the janitor at the station. And so I think, we have to really start to think about how we position particularly young people to understand that, sometimes it's not just the subtle things that people do and say, but it's also, something as basic as compensation, access to promotions, access to information within an organization, and also just generally opportunities. You may not get prime projects. You may not get support staff. So there are all kinds of ways that these things show up. And so there are rules, but sometimes there aren't rules. And we just have to really start to think about how we can support each other, and particularly our young professionals, in navigating all of that. Because as one young man said to me, all through school and all through college, he was a remarkable student, and everyone kept saying, yes, you can, yes, you can. And then when he entered the workplace, it was pretty clear that the world was not ready for him. And so just how to continue to navigate successfully in spite of all of that.
That's a great point. And one of the things I want to go back to in your anecdote, the first one about the young broadcast journalist, is she was told she's making less money than the janitor, which happens a lot. And one of the questions that we would ask is, why would I make less than this person who has a different skill set? And do you happen to have an answer to that question that she may have asked when she said, hey, am I getting paid less than a janitor, or am I getting paid less? Because I know what happens in a lot of cases, and I want to see if this matches that.
Yeah.
Because ideally, sometimes what they'll say is the janitor's been here for 10 years or 12 years or 20 years. And we have to be very assertive as people of color to say, the skill set you brought me in for, in the market in which this skill set is offered, does not necessarily reflect a level of experience. In other words, what I bring to the table is experience independent. And that person who's been here 20 years may be very skilled at what they do, but they can be fairly easily replaced, whereas the skill set I'm bringing, my unique skill set, my incredible ability that I bring to this particular organization needs to be compensated properly for the marketplace. And we have to be willing to assert ourselves when we are not being compensated fairly because someone says, well, you haven't been here long enough. It's not about how long I've been here. It's about the kind of contribution I can make and do make to the organization.
Yeah, and I would just add in that situation, the janitor does not have more tenure than the journalist, and in fact, I think he assumed that she was asking, never imagining that he was making more, but given her reputation, he thought that she was looking out for his interests to make sure that he was being paid a fair wage. So just something to kind of have in the back of our minds as we kind of think about and contemplate rules.
Daniel, thank you so much for that. That's exactly the kind of example of rules and rule breaking we're going to talk about throughout the session today. As we continue, I want to make sure we understand that we're going to break the rules on purpose. And that's the hard part of this concept, is that a lot of us have been socialized because of where we were brought up, by whom we were brought up, or the part of the country we live in, that we follow the rules. And one of the problems is that these implicit rules that are quietly given to us, that we often repeat to ourselves without thinking, that they become background noise. And when it comes to, especially when it comes to race, people of color have more rules, and we have more, quote unquote, know your place. We can see even in Sunday's demonstration of solidarity against what President Trump said, that these gentlemen, very strong men, broke the rules. They literally said, we will not tolerate that. And they took what was once an assumed rule, and they made it obvious, and then they broke it. They said, we don't have to do it this way. And being a rule breaker in the workplace can come with risk, but it means when you're willing to take that risk on, there is often an exceptional reward, whether that's more freedom and opportunity for you, or if it means that you are changing how people perceive you in the workplace. So the second bullet there is assert what matters is so important to us because we have to focus on success versus conformity. And one of the things that we're expected to, especially as people of color, is to conform. And when we step outside of what people expect of us, we are taking on risk that we need to be very conscious of. It doesn't mean don't take the risk. It doesn't mean be afraid of the risk. But what it does mean is that understand that when you step outside of what people consider the norm, you are potentially going to be looked at differently. And that can be to your credit or to your detriment. And we have to be conscious of that. And that's why making the assumed obvious allows us to make it the decision. Do I want to break this rule today? How will I break this rule today? And what will happen if I break this rule today? I want every person who's listening to us today to become the voice of reason, who says, I'm breaking this rule consciously because it doesn't make sense, because it restricts me as a worker, it restricts me as a person of color, it doesn't give me an opportunity to share my voice, it doesn't allow me to demonstrate my skills and my talent. Every time we break a rule, we should be the voice of reason for why that rule is being broken. And we should have a logical argument, even if the logic is, you know, that's not how this is supposed to work. And tell people very clearly that I'm stepping into territory that you consider dangerous in order to prove a point that the way we're doing this, whether it's hiring or firing or a project, is not acceptable and does not lead to the success we say we want. And so we get to the meat of the matter, which is how do you break the rules? There are two things that I consider whenever I do this. And one of the things that Danielle did, and if you haven't yet followed her on LinkedIn, I suggest you do, is because she has posted several examples of rule breaking throughout her feed, and she is doing two things I think that are brilliant in her posts. One is she knows herself, and one of the things about Danielle that is clear once you meet her, once you get to know her, just listening to her, is that she's going to protect her reputation. She did not earn her degrees without work, and so part of her process is she's going to make sure she knows how best to portray herself. She takes risks, but she takes risks wisely. She knows who she is and she knows what she stands for. Emil is someone who studies his work environment, his culture, and his boss extensively. I'm an entrepreneur today, but I've had many, many bosses in the past. And one of the things is I know who I work for, where I work, and the culture within which I work. And I'm going to initiate conflict. I'm going to break a rule when it makes sense to advance the mission. I'm going to present my argument so that content is my only focus. And because I've studied my boss, I've studied my environment, I've studied my work culture, I can stand in front of anyone I want to, peer, supervisor, subordinate, stakeholder, and I can stand firm in my conviction that I'm intending to cross this chasm, this rule that is not working for us properly, and I'll show how it's not working, why it's not working. And if that means I have to stand up for someone, especially because as an officer in the United States Air Force, I had to learn how to navigate other people's bias. And sometimes I would confront it, and sometimes I would circumvent it, but in all cases, once I recognized it, I dealt with it. And one of the things is, because sometimes bias is implicit in the culture, you may not necessarily be able to articulate a passionate argument successfully. So you have to have multiple ways to solve the problem to ensure that when you step on that rule, when you break that rule, what you're seeking is success, advancing the mission, getting the project done, getting your task done, making your organization, your boss, or yourself look good along the way. And so, so how you do that is twofold in my estimation.
So I don't know if I'm getting ahead of us, but I think also before you break anything, be good at what you do.
Amen.
Be really good at what you do. I tend to probably, because I don't have the discipline that Emil probably has as a result of his military career. You know, I feel like the nonprofit sector is kind of like the creative industry. It's touchy-feely, malleable, made to be organic, dynamic, but structured in a lot of ways. But I think as I've advanced in my career, I'm very clear about the value that I bring to any organization. And I think, you know, one of the things that I try to guide some of the folks on teams that I've led around is like be the best at whatever you have been hired to do, particularly if you're a person of color, before you try to break the rules on any level. So I think it's, yes, important. It's kind of know what you're willing to risk. Also, you know, all of my kind of pushing at the edges of organizations and systems have not, you know, necessarily led to personal reward, but I know who I need to be in order to sleep at night. And so in some cases, I'm willing to kind of put myself out there a little bit. But more importantly than anything, know your job, know the organization, but be really good at what you do. You should be able to say, these are the 5 things that you get in terms of my excellence that I don't have to ask anybody else's opinion around. I'm very clear that I'm good at my job.
Danielle, you're not getting ahead, and I think that's something that needs to be stated emphatically from for any worker who's thinking about how to stand out. First, do your job and do it well. We're going to talk about one of the rules We're going to go through several examples of rules here in a moment. And and so one of the things that the rules kind of show us is that if you don't do well, it doesn't matter how well you break a rule. You have no credibility. You have no source of respect. And so the first and most important element in anything we're talking about today is to be a rock solid performer and be someone who is reliable in the context of getting the job done. That's exactly how you build up to the point where when you do have to lean on a rule, you can and do so wisely. And another thing you said, Danielle, that I think is powerful that we all need to hear twice is, can you sleep at night? Can you take care of you at the end of the day? Can you sleep well knowing that you did what you were supposed to do? What's in your heart and what's in your mind is in line with your actions. And a lot of us, many of us have had to compromise, and we should never have to do that. We should never have to compromise just to live our best life. You know, I'm not talking to anyone here who's a career criminal in the context of wanting to do dirt. So that means that you have basically a good heart and you're trying to do the right thing. No one should force you outside of yourself to make you do your job. I think that's something that bore repeating, and I'm glad you brought it up, Danielle. Here are just a few rules. Kind of wanted to give you some examples of things that we've heard or had to live with, and sort of how to break them. So I want to just kind of give you these real quick, and before we get into questions and answers, just keep the questions coming. You guys put them in the chat box, send them over to Jody. She's taking them all in. She's going to be assembling the questions and throwing them back at me and Danielle. And so if you have a question for me, please send it. If you have a question for Danielle, please send it. And specify it's for Emil or Danielle. And if it's for both of us or neither, or you don't care, just keep on going. Bloom where you're planted. Just wherever they put you is the place to start, which is 100% true. The reason why we say break it, though, is because if you focus exclusively on your position without understanding the context of your position, you may turn yourself into a cog in a machine instead of a valuable contributor to the mission and team. And so what we want you to do is in this case, is expand your vision. Find all the people, offices, and stakeholders who could possibly be affected by your position or project, and then look forward to how you can shape success for them and therefore for yourself. And so this is a little bit different than just bloom where you're planted. Just sit there, take the work they give you, do it, and do it well, but actually broaden yourself, look outside of your immediate sphere of influence, and begin to look at how what you do affects other people and how you can help them so that you can make yourself a larger, more successful part of the team.
And also kind of, and Emil, you've kind of touched on this, you know, I always found it astounding, two things. First, that sometimes it was hard to get young professionals of color to apply for executive assistant roles. And I'll say why I thought that was troubling. As CEO, I have my hands on every facet of an organization: fundraising, programs, finance, communications and external relations, interfacing with city agencies. So necessarily, whoever functioned in that executive assistance role for me was going to have access that no one else in the organization would necessarily have. So don't let titles and where you think you should be in your career be misleading. Really think about the job function and what you can learn and how it can help you to kind of enrich your skill set. And the other thing is, I was always really surprised at how dismissive people could be to administrative support folks, because sometimes those are the folks who are going to be the only people in an organization who can actually secure a meeting with another team leader, who can, make sure that your memo, your email gets prioritized in an organization. But more importantly, I always found it offensive when people were not respectful of my assistants. So just be mindful of how you present and engage people across the organization, because title doesn't always connote power and influence in the way that people think it does. So that's just my little bit there.
No, that's spot on, Danielle, and that's something that we're going to continue talking about. Hopefully, as we get more questions from everyone, this is the kind of thing that makes people say, why would you do it this way? You know, I can easily make a six-figure income as a consultant in the Washington, D.C. area, and I can get paid nicely as an employee. So why would I want to start a career as an entrepreneur? Because, for instance, I want to tell a story or share my wisdom in a way that is limited by being in someone else's organization. Similarly, the executive assistant may sound like a step down for some, but what it may do is actually open doors that would otherwise be closed, because now you do, as you said, Danielle, have access to people and opportunities, and you can see the inner workings. But here's something that very few people realize in those executive assistant roles. You get mentored by the boss, period. Whether or not they intend to mentor you, they're going to show you what it takes to be a CEO. They're going to show you what it takes to be a C-suite executive or high-level executive in the organization. And that in and of itself is a powerful way to continue learning and growing in your career. One of the things that I was taught in the military was don't watch the clock. And one of the things that I was taught was the reason why is because if I watch the clock, then everyone beneath me will too. Well, there's a corollary to that, and that is if I'm watching the clock, everyone's thinking that I'm doing the minimum, and I don't want people thinking I'm doing the minimum and therefore being the model of minimum behavior. Breaking it doesn't necessarily mean don't watch the clock or don't do this thing, but it means how you do a thing. And so sometimes, as Danielle alluded to, in the executive assistant role, you watch your boss's clock and you ask dumb questions like, are you taking care of yourself today, sir? Ma'am, have you eaten properly today? Have you taken time to call your kids? The executive assistant role can be a very powerful one in that context, because now you are no longer stuck on, I got a job, start at 9, I get off at 5, and I get a 1-hour lunch break. But you're talking about the quality of the time that you spend. Are you making a contribution that has legs throughout the organization? And so when you're watching your boss's clock, when you're watching your peers' clock, when you're taking care of yourself in the context of wellness, then maybe what you're doing is, instead of saying, I'm on till 9, I'm off at 5, is that some nights you'll work late, other days you'll come in later, or if you have flex time as an opportunity. But what you're going to do is you're going to start to transform how you interact with your position and role, because you're not focused on one specific aspect.
And I was just going to add, one of the things that I had to kind of relearn for myself is that, sometimes in a senior leadership role, people are constantly asking you for stuff. And so no one really cares if you ate, if you're thirsty, if you're tired. And so just having relationships with people on staff to make sure that I'm engaging in good self-care habits. Those are the kinds of things that people remember in addition to how you perform your job. Just, the ability to be empathetic and thoughtful.
I like it, and it's important. I'm going to skip the next rule, boss's priority is my priority. We kind of just talked about that, and I'm going to go to the next one. Because it affects people of color significantly. I really want to get to questions, and so I'm not going to belabor these rules, but I'm trying to give everyone who's listening an example of some of the things that are kind of unwritten, or they're not always obvious, but we follow them or we break them without being consciously aware of the intent or effect of our behavior. So one of the things that you'll learn or hear a lot of times is be social and have drinks with the team. And being part of the team off the job is important for on-the-job perception. And why would you break it? You start with impeccable job performance, what Danielle talked about earlier. When social events come, you decide when and how to engage. It's not about the money, because water can be a drink. So now you understand that when you're not present at certain social functions, and some of us, we're single parents, some of us, we have elders to care for, or we have a second job that we're going to attend, or we have school at night. we are going to make these conscious decisions. And why this is important is when you make a conscious decision to break a rule or honor a rule, it has repercussions both ways. And so a lot of times as people of color, especially when you happen to be the only brown face in the office, as I was almost all of my career in the military, at the rank that I was, especially as I became higher in rank, you have to be consciously aware of what it means to break that rule if you choose to. And sometimes it's not a matter of if you do or don't go, or if you do or don't drink. It's a matter of, are you a team player? And people are much more forgiving when they see that you're working together on the job if you're not always present at the off-the-job social function. And so if you don't have that rock-solid performance, you can't make up for it at the social event, although it may or may not help a little bit. But more importantly, what it will not do is it will not make you better when you're already doing poorly. So you're going to have to make these decisions from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness. And as people of color, we have to be the ones who decide, do I really want to endure the social time in the context of maybe not listening to music I like or going to a place that I would frequent versus my on-the-job performance? And so we have to make those decisions. And I can't tell you which one you make. I can only say that if you're going to break the rule, be conscious of it and understand yourself and your environment.
And I would just say it kind of goes back to the organizational culture that you're involved in. I have definitely worked in, most of my experiences in the nonprofit sector in offices where there are a lot of young folks in the space. And so we were multiracial, we were, differently identified in terms of sexuality, gender, all of that stuff. And people felt very comfortable socializing. But I will acknowledge that I've also worked in organizations where it's taken so much mental fortitude for me to kind of be effective at work and get through the day, that the idea of spending my free time with people I didn't necessarily respect was not something that I looked forward to. So self-care, right? Making sure that you protect your spaces outside of the office.
That's
but
right.
to the extent that you have opportunities to build a broader network, probably at a certain point in my career, most of the people that I was socializing with were other nonprofit CEOs, like those who belong to Black agency executives. But I've also been recently challenging myself to broaden my network and intentionally put myself in spaces where I'm, interfacing with folks from the corporate sector, from philanthropy, who are young white folks, who are old white folks, just to make sure that my thinking doesn't become limited and narrow as well. And some of those social events have been through formal organizations that I joined with that express purpose. So, just more than one way to skin a cat, and just keep that in mind.
Hey, Danielle, I love it. I really, really, really appreciate that comment, because as you and I, we have vastly different career paths, but here we are intersected in this conversation with these groups. And I was in the military from high school. I went to the Air Force Academy, and then from the Air Force Academy stayed in the military for an entire career. About 5 years ago is when I left. And so I had to transform my thinking. I settled in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I had to transform my thinking to accommodate what I had never experienced before. Back when I was in the military, I'm going to sound like an old guy, but gay and lesbians were not welcome. And I lived under Don't Ask, Don't Tell the entirety of my career. And at the same time, when I got out of the military, gay and lesbian people were just as common as anyone else. And I had to learn how to accommodate that. It wasn't a hard transition for me, but it was something that prior to, it was not normal. It was not in my world, and now it is. And so every time we come into these different social environments, we have to be willing to acknowledge our ignorance or our lack of familiarity, and then make a decision as to how to proceed. We can go forth and conquer. We can go forth humbly or frightfully, but we do make these decisions. And every time we make a decision, we're either honoring or breaking a rule.
Right.
This is the last. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Anecdote to that. Just being conscious of how to always be challenging your thinking, Emil, because you touched on that. So I did have a colleague at a previous role who was lesbian, and I also had a number of Black male students who were incredibly homophobic, and so I remember like getting into this philosophical argument with this young man and my colleague, whom he adored but didn't know anything about her personal life. He said that he would never accept any support or help from someone who was gay. And so we had a good chuckle after he left her office, because it's like, boy, you are in here every day asking for something. And you have no idea who you're talking to. So, you know, just be kind of mindful of those kinds of things. Obviously, he was a kid, but, you know, in the workplace, you never know where your help is going to come from.
I love it. And I can't stress enough that when we limit ourselves by some bias that we bring to the organization, we almost always miss out on an opportunity to learn and grow. And you know, if we're not here to grow, what are we here for? And so I stress to anyone who's listening to us, and to all the people that I mentor, challenge yourself over and over again. Danielle said it twice, and I can't echo it enough. We've got to be willing to confront our own biases. We've got to be uncomfortable in certain situations. There's a time and space for comfort. You know, when you walk through the door of your own home, you can be comfortable there, but when you're out, sometimes you need to be a little uncomfortable and challenge yourself and say, okay, today I'm going to do something that doesn't feel normal, but that's not a bad thing. Before we finish and go to questions and answers, I just want one more rule, because as for a lot of you who are younger, you're new to the workforce or you're new to your position, you'll be told, build a reputation before making changes. And the why there is the new guy doesn't have a credibility until they've seen a few things. Well, you know, I'm going to say it this way and be very directive, as I once was in the military. You, young lady, are here because I don't know what you know. More importantly, your new eyes and fresh face may be the difference between success and failure in a mission, because all of us old guys are doing it the same old way. And you are new. So don't think just because you haven't seen a few things that your voice isn't valid, that you can't suggest a change. And part of being a rule breaker is recognizing, especially when you're new to an organization, new to a career, especially when you're fresh out of school, that you may have a valid voice in the argument despite your relative newness. You were hired for a reason. It was your voice, your vision, the addition you bring to the office. So assert your position, assert your opinion when you see an opportunity. And that's often a rule broken. They expect silence from the new worker. They expect you to learn. They want your eyes open and your mouth closed. And I'm telling you, and I know Danielle will echo it in her way, that you can't always be quiet when you see things not going the way they should.
Amen.
And those are the rules. And we have some time for questions and answers. You know, Danielle's been throwing some great anecdotes out. I've got tons of anecdotes. So if you haven't already, please make sure you type out a few, type out your questions and address them to either me or Danielle or both of us or neither of us, so we can answer them. So Jody, what do you have for us?
This was great, Danielle, when you first chimed in and you brought up about, you know, how sometimes rules are made up. And I was thinking about how when we were all kids and we were losing at a game, we would change the rules quickly. Like, no, you need 3 of those to win. No, you need 5 of these to win. And unfortunately, that also happens in the workplace. And the person winning for you. You need to be winning for yourself. So that made me laugh and chuckle, because I'm like, yeah, I remember that, you know, you get a box and they don't have the rules in the box, and suddenly Yahtzee turns into who knows what.
Right.
And the same thing happens in the workplace, and you have to be able to juggle and go with it, and sometimes create rules. And God forbid, you've run an organization. I work for myself. I hire people all the time. And you have to have your rules clear, your business plan clear, what you're trying to get done clear. And so when you said you really have to be good at what you do before you break a rule or become a rule breaker is so true. But I can honestly say I've broken some rules and, learned on the other side how badly I broke them. So you also don't want to destroy your career. And that kind of comes to this very first question that came from a few people. So I'm kind of musing this together for both of you, that, unfortunately, not everyone who's on our audience today, and including ourselves at times, not as financially stable to kind of take a risk, break a rule, depending on the role they play. Some people might be living paycheck to paycheck, or by not doing something, they might be, get some unpaid time or given some time off. So, if you both can kind of address, and you both did to some degree, talk about, when rule breaking makes sense, when it's appropriate, not when you're going to lose a job, not when, but, and then sometimes there's rules you have to break just for survival. Sometimes not getting paid somewhere could be the answer. But, if there's examples that you guys have of that, when, back up against the wall.
Yeah, that's a good question. I will go first.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to my military time. There were a couple of times I was a fairly well seasoned officer that I had a boss who was incredibly hard to work for. It was not a matter of my competence or lack thereof. It was a matter of me. And it was just conflict for conflict's sake, it seemed like. And so because I couldn't get right, I couldn't figure out what to do to solve the problem. I just increased my level of performance to the nth degree. It was hard. And so instead of breaking rules, I followed them ridiculously rigidly. And what that did was it gave me a reputation outside of the organization as someone who was rock solid. It made my work for that boss easier in that context, although every day I had to come to work and deal with that person. And every day my career was in jeopardy because of that conflict. And so the way that I resolved it was twofold. One, I was a tremendous performer, even though I wasn't getting credit for it in the organization because of the boss I worked for. But the other part was that because I had done so much on behalf of my boss's boss began to look for opportunities for me to leave the organization. And it came to pass that eventually my boss's boss said, I can't see another day of this. It's just I'm just not going to tolerate it, and got me out of the situation. And it wasn't because I was a brown noser. It wasn't because I was drinking with the boss, with that particular person. It was because that they just saw my competence. Like, compared to every other of my peers, I was head and shoulders above. But in that boss's perspective, I was still half as good. And so I didn't per se break the rules, but what I did do was I did perform at a level that most people would consider unconscious in order to escape the situation, and I finally did get out of it. And to those who are already at that level, here's what I'll tell you. Always seek a way to share your skill set with people outside your organization. Always build a network that allows you to demonstrate your value to people who can appreciate it if you're not appreciated in your organization. Sometimes the only way to get out of a bad situation is to get out of it.
Mm-hmm. And just to echo that, obviously I'm a spiritual person, so I think that God places me exactly where he wants me when he wants me there. But I did not apply for my current role. And so this goes to the point of managing your personal brand. there were people who had seen my announcement that I was leaving my previous role and, just kind of going on the open road and was going to see what I was going to see, who said, wait a minute, she's available. Stop whatever process we have in place and let's, actively and vigorously try to recruit her. And it's so funny because it was a younger woman who I had previously been mentoring, who now is really coming into her own, who said to me, you're not going to get your next job with your resume. You're going to get your next job with your reputation. And she was right. So just making sure that you have a brand for doing what you do well, that people in your sector are aware of your expertise, means that people will identify you and call on you, and recruiters will look for you based on your reputation and not the function or the company where you are.
And let me just say one more thing before we go to the next question, Jody, and that is sometimes a bad boss can be your best endorser, and that is when a recruiter calls for a reference to that boss that you wish they did and say the things that you wish they didn't say. It's not always that their word is bond. Sometimes they're going to say, wait a second, this is an anomaly in a pattern. And some of us who've been managed out or have been treated less than fairly, we have to respect the fact that there are people who can spot when it's not about our talent and it's not about our skills, but instead it's about that particular situation, that particular boss. And they may, and oftentimes have, overlooked what that boss would say in order to hire you because they realize that that boss their reputation may be terrible in the industry. And so when they get that quote, they're maybe confirming their own bad reputation versus trying to make you look bad.
Mm-hmm. Well, Danielle, this next question's for you because you brought it up in one way, but it came in multiple, which is, there's someone in our audience today who definitely took the EA route, the executive assistant route, and other folks who have taken skills or jobs that, quote unquote, let's just say would be perceived as overqualified for, or maybe they were just qualified at that time. But now they're trying to transition their career, so sector switchers, and it's been difficult for some of them to make that shift, especially those who are in an executive assistant role, although we know that could be a program director at a nonprofit. We know that it could be something completely different. So they're just looking for some advice on, how to move into a different role, and how to not let one title kind of become your plague as you try to move on.
And so, I will say that in some ways we are, as a society, in the workplace, kind of not as creative and forward-thinking as we could be. And I'll give myself as an example. There were aspects about and if you follow me on LinkedIn, you can read the story of how I went from CEO to chief of staff. But there were definitely recruiters who said to me, listen, you've had 2 successful runs as a CEO. Is anybody going to buy you as anything other than the CEO? And yet there were aspects of the job that I loved, and there were aspects of the job that after 15 years, I wanted some relief from. So really helping people. And so one of the ways that I answered that was that, I had been president, my term just ended like last week, of Black agency executive, so I knew a lot of CEOs. I had been a CEO. Who is more qualified to support and have the back of a visionary CEO than someone who's actually sat in that seat? And so, luckily for me, our CEO kind of got it, that there's a certain lens and vantage point and perspective that people won't necessarily have if they haven't had that role. I would say that you really need to reorganize your CV to focus on special projects that you may have had the opportunity to lead successfully, to really highlight your skill set and minimize people's eye going to the particular title, and then really just kind of network and explain to people who can become your advocates and help to tell your story about why going from an EA role to a director's role makes perfect sense. And I have seen a number of folks, at least in my industry, in the nonprofit industry, make this pivot successfully. But it just may require some rewording on the CV, getting advocates who can help to tell your story. I had a rule where I really don't want you to be my EA more than 3 years. Mm-hmm. And so usually when we get to the end of the 3 years, I'm either, in my case, I've done people's recommendations for graduate school. Like, I know the limit. I went out of my way to hire really smart people. And I knew that, after 3 years, if you haven't moved on, you're either going to get mad at me or just super comfortable and you won't be growing. And good managers are not just leading people for the now, but really, as a teacher, I'm always developing the people around me, and I understand that means that they'll need to transition. So if you have that kind of relationship with your supervisor, that person can absolutely be a resource. People have felt very comfortable saying, I'm looking for work. And people look differently when they say, you can call my current CEO and ask her what she thinks about my performance. And, sometimes the response was like, for real? And it's like, yeah, I'm not here to hold anybody back. I have no problem getting on the phone and, just saying so-and-so has really outgrown the role in this organization. I don't have something that's necessarily a match for their interest for them to pivot into. And I want to see them do well. So that's my feel.
Yeah, no, I think that's always, there's a fine line also of how long, that was one of the old rules. Oh, I got to stay someplace for a certain amount of time before I've never had a job longer than 2 years and I'm doing just fine. So, don't feel that you're stuck, and most of you are living in states where it's at will. So, and you never know when someone like Danielle, myself, or Emil might just be letting you go because we believe that you need to be doing something better. Might not just be a budget cut. So keep that in mind. So now the questions kind of come a little bit more, Danielle, you're kind of getting towards that, but maybe both of you can kind of speak to the idea of, breaking rules, doing some things a new way, but also when you're trying, where do you find that balance on social media, on LinkedIn, versus your resume, and then in the networking? It's like you were both speaking to how we all need to kind of cross-pollinate if you're working in marketing, but you want to eventually be in IT, you need to find some projects that maybe cross that over or join some groups. But, how much of that really, is social media, and then how much of it needs to be live? Do you think, is the networking the bigger thing? I have my own opinions on all of this, but, for you, what has seemed to work for both of you?
Go ahead, Danielle.
Yeah, so I don't mind answering. I think, I've had more success in person than kind of making meaningful connections via social media. But social media is also incredibly powerful, and that's why I've been spending a little bit more time, developing my profile and doing more writing on LinkedIn in particular, because, I just had an event for women on Sunday, And I was like blown away that someone in the audience was like, yeah, I saw this on LinkedIn and I signed up. I also, met someone who's become a really good friend of mine, who was an educator out in California. She saw some work that I was doing being featured online. She reached out to me. She brought people from her school from LA to New York, and we've kind of continued a friendship because our values are so aligned. So I would say, the other thing that LinkedIn has done for me, and just kind of writing in general, I've written for HuffPost, City Limits, and some other publications, is, potential employers should have a real sense of who I am before they make me an offer. So, if you're looking for someone who plays it safe, who doesn't want to talk about race, who doesn't want to talk about gender, and you Googled me, then you would know, oh, she is not the one for this organization. So it really means that I have meaningful opportunities to engage with people who kind of respect the fact that I can be, pretty forthright on issues that people generally find uncomfortable. But for me, the online piece is important. It's a way in the current, century to kind of build your brand. But, try to be who you say you are online. That's the other thing. So this is not like, dating and, pulling a bait and switch. So, I think that I've also worked really hard, and people have said, wow, when I meet you, I experience you in person in the same way that I experienced you online. And I think just alignment works. Don't exaggerate, don't lie, obviously. Just be authentic. I'm always shocked when I go to speaking engagements and people are like, wow, like, you were so real. And I'm like, well, is everybody else lying? What's going on here? If you want to inform people and give them information, make it real, make it count, and find the balance that's right for you.
I concur, and will add one very minor point, and that is the purpose of networking is to build out a group of people who can help you and whom you can help. And those are the two things that are so important in the networking game. People you can help and people who can help you. And the reason why we build a network is because going alone sucks, and it's hard, and it doesn't work very well for very long. And so we have to have a network that allows us to transform our future by being people that can be relied upon, and by having people in our lives upon whom we can rely. And as Danielle said, the authenticity piece of this is, I'm coming to you because I don't know something I would like to know. And based on who you are, I like to learn from you. That's a great, you come to me with that question, you're going to get my time. I don't care how busy I am. I will always find time to mentor people or help people or just talk with people because it's valuable. But on the flip, and I'm not looking for any exchange other than if you came to me with a question, I want to come to you with an answer. But building an online presence allows me to answer lots of questions. So I build an online presence that actually takes questions from lots of different people, turns it into wisdom that I've offered them, and then I present that wisdom online in order to continue adding to the body of knowledge that I can present to the world. And then when people ask me as an author or as an innovator to come and speak to them, they're going to find out that what I have to share reflects that accumulated wisdom. I'll put it together in 17 different ways, but it's a lot of fun for me to be able to present so many different things in that context of networking, whom I can help and whom can help me. It's not a hard formula. I mean, that's why my network has several thousand people in it, because at some point they came to me with a question and I came to them with a question. We helped each other, and now we continue to build our network based on the fact that we can help each other.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you both on behalf of the National Urban League and myself for joining us today. for this kickoff of our fall into winter digital career success series. The next one coming up is moving up the ladder, how to get your next promotion. So it's hard enough to break rules. Sometimes as you break rules, you might get rungs, or you might find yourself moving up a ladder or making a lateral move. But everyone wants to know how to ask, how to get, and how to be worthy of a promotion. And it comes up time and time again. And I hope today both Emil and Danielle have kind of set you up for success, not just to get a job, to keep a job, but then maybe to move up. So I hope you guys will all join us on October 11th. And if you're not already following the Urban League Jobs Network, you can find the Urban League Jobs Network on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So find us there for the next event. Clearly, if you're already listening to us now, you're in our feed, but please share with your friends. And really, Danielle and Emil, I cannot thank you enough. This was a great conversation. We all need to continue to break some rules, not just for ourselves, but for those coming behind us, as Danielle has alluded to, and also to make some rules. So thank you. And have a great
afternoon. Thank you, Jody. I appreciate it. I appreciate the National Urban League.
Jody. Thank you.
Share all this.
All right. Bye-bye.
Danielle, you know I owe you one now, so whatever it is you're asking me to do, I know it's going to be big.
Done.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.